work that you did on Psalm 23. We did verses 1 to 3 and then verse 6. To get the most out of this video, I would suggest having access to your own homework if you completed the assignment. The Arnold Choi text, which is what we're using for grammatical analysis, and also your access to the Hebrew text itself. I would recommend having access to whatever you used to find your own parsing. If you look at the screen here, this is what accordance looks like. I'm not advocating that anybody buys this, but what I have here is I have the BHS text, but then I have opened 3 English translations. And as I tried to make clear in the instructions, what we're trying to do is analyze the Hebrew text using the categories in Arnold Choi to make sense of different options of how it can be translated into English. And one of the easiest ways to do that is actually learn to critique the English translations you use for your biblical studies work. And so then you can begin to make some decisions. And what we're looking for long term is the best time to break out the use of Hebrew or Greek is when you're closely reading the biblical text. Again, if you can sight read Greek or Hebrew, you can skip this step with the other translations. But I'm guessing really probably nobody in this class is literally making your own translation and have a real command of it. So what you want to do long-term, practice your Hebrew, but here's when you would always want to use Greek or Hebrew. Get 2 or 3 well-respected modern translations and compare them and look for the places where the differences aren't merely a difference of synonyms. So for example, like in the Psalm 23, notice all 3 translations start out, "The Lord is my shepherd." So we'll look at that. We're going to judge if that's accurate. But notice the second line, "I shall not want." That's what the NRSV and the ESV does. And then notice the NIV does, "I lack nothing." So there's an actual difference there, not just the difference between lacking or wanting, but notice the tense. NRSV, ESV has this in the future. The NIV has this in the present. That's a difference in meaning, and that's the kind of thing that you want to notice because those are saying 2 different things, right? The language sounds the same, but it's different in terms of interpretation. Now, for our practice, what we're doing is we're doing all the words, and this is more to get a feel for things. But again, if you heard me long term, a shortcut to know when to use Greek or Hebrew is to compare modern translations looking for places where there's differences, because what that means is really smart folks are reading the Hebrew or the Greek, if you're doing in the New Testament, in different ways. And so the purpose of grammatical analysis is to learn to discover the force behind the words versus merely assuming that we understand the biblical text because we're reading it in our modern language. All right, with that being said, let's go ahead and jump in. Again, if you have any questions as we go through, write your questions down so that you can send them to me on the forums, and I'll do my very best to help you to get even better at Hebrew as we work throughout the semester. The next couple of weeks in my exegesis classes will continue to practice grammatical analysis. And so if you found that this was a little difficult, it should get easier with intentional practice. But again, if you didn't use Arnold Choi, then you didn't do what I was asking. If you only parsed words, you didn't do what I was asking. I'm asking you to parse the words, identify the Hebrew words, and then describe how they're used in a modern translation using the categories from Arnold Choi. So let's go ahead and jump in. Again, the superscription itself in the Hebrew, you'll notice this is true in all the Psalms. The first verse also includes the superscriptions that are pulled out of the Psalm in English. So I'm not necessarily asking you to grammatically work with this because this is literally just a superscription, but it's mizmor. This is some sort of musical term or genre term that you'll see on the Psalms. And then, if you wanted to analyze something, we do have a prepositional phrase, le David. So this is the preposition lamed, and all the prepositions are 4.1. And so if you go back to 4.1 point, I think it's 10, but let me just double check. 4.1.10 lamed. Traditionally this is taken as a possessive lamed, so a psalm of David. It can that would be category F, 4.1.10.F. Could also be quasi-datitival interest or advantage. In other words, a mizmor for David. In other words, this doesn't necessarily have to be read as an authorship. It can also be understood as kind of being in honor of, if you will. Anyway, let's jump into the actual psalm itself. Okay, we're going to break this into pieces. And so we have Yahweh and then a word that means, it's getting translated in English, my shepherd, but we're going to get into the weeds of this. Now, obviously the subject here is Yahweh, so this is a noun functioning in the nominative state as a subject, okay? Now, Yahweh is taken as Lord. I explained this in other videos, but again, this is, notice Lord is not the translation of Yahweh. Lord is the traditional way that the synagogue has honored God by never pronouncing his name. So this would be like if this said, Brian is my shepherd, and then because you respect me as your professor, instead of saying Brian because you don't feel comfortable, you say doctor or professor. It's the same thing. So Lord is not God's name. God's name is Yahweh. All right, so that's the subject, nominative subject. Then we get a word, roi. Now the hirik yod there is a pronominal suffix. That's where the my's coming from. And notice the word for shepherd. It's not actually a noun. It's a verb. It's a participle. It's a call participle, masculine singular, with a first common singular suffix on it. So to analyze this properly, we're going to have to analyze it as a verb. Now, the call part's easy. The call is either an action or a state. And this is the action of shepherding, right? And so that's a fientive, call. And then for the participle, you want to go to 3.4.3 under participles. And, our English translations are all taking this as just a noun. And so it's like the one shepherding me, my shepherd. Literally, it's the one shepherding me. But this is my shepherd, and so this would be an example of a substantive participle. So this would be 3.4.3c. Now the second phrase, lo is no. That's always easy. That's just the negation, and in this case it's negating the main verb. Eksar, which is a call imperfect first common singular, from chasar, which means lack or decrease. Again, is it for the call, fientive or stative? Well, if it's you don't want to. You could think of lack as a state, but it's really I am lacking, I am decreasing, I am not decreasing, I am not lacking. It's one of those arguable ones. Strictly stative verbs are verbs like I am old. So like a true stative verb, it comes across in English as an adjective. So I would call this a fientive, but don't get hung up on that because sometimes the distinction is very fine. The more important thing is this is what kind of imperfect is this? Because notice we have a real difference. Two of our translations say I shall not want. The NIV says I lack nothing. Now, I'm not just getting at not wanting and lacking nothing are essentially the same. That's a synonym thing, and you can decide on the nuance if you're going to do a word study. What I'm more interested in is what's the tense? Is this saying the Lord is my shepherd, so I will not want? Or is this the Lord is my shepherd, I am not wanting, I am not lacking anything, right? So go to imperfect and look at 3.2.2, and notice the NRSV and the ESV here, they take the imperfect as a future, which means it's looking ahead, it's anticipating something. So the Lord is my shepherd, so I will not want. Now, the NIV makes it immediate. The Lord is my shepherd, I am lacking nothing. I lack nothing. Now, that's an exegetical difference. We want to notice that, right? And so if you read down through the categories, that's an example of a progressive imperfect. So it's happening now. Okay, so let's just note that, and we don't have to make a decision, but there's a difference there. There's an exegetical difference. This could be a future, it could be a progressive. All right, let's go ahead and look at verse 2. Verse 2 begins with a preposition bait. And so we have a prepositional phrase, and let's find the object. And so the noun that it's attached to is the word for pasture, or pastures, because it's plural. It's feminine plural construct. Well, and because it's construct means it goes with the word that comes after it, which is the word for grass, or translated green here. So this is a construct chain is the object of the preposition. So we're going to need to do two things here. We're going to have to analyze the preposition bait, and then we're going to have to analyze the construct chain naot deshe. Okay? So what's the force of the bait? If you look that up in 4.1, go to the back. This is pretty obvious. This is one of the very first of the categories in 4.1. This is going to be an example of a bait, a spatial bait. It's the first one. It's the verb is going to have something to do with lying down, and it shows where am I lying down? In what? Pastures of green, in pastures of grass, right? Okay, so the force of that prepositional phrase is locative. And then what's the meaning of this construct chain? And remember, constructs mean, or bound, that's what Cook calls it. It's the second word, is the word that's the genitive. And so we want to ask what kind of genitive this is. And so go back to our nouns, go back to 2.2, and we want to look up what type of genitive. Now, the most common genitive is possession, which, and here it doesn't work because it isn't saying by or in pastures belonging to green or pastures belonging to grass. This isn't possessive. So if you go down through the categories, what is this talking about? The most likely one here is attributive. Because what's an attributive genitive? A genitive that's in the attributive case describes the noun in front of it. And that's what this does here. And that's why in English, you notice, and this is consistent, they translate the word green as though it's an adjective. So if you have a word that's a genitive and it's functioning as an adjective, that's what's called an attributive genitive. Okay, let's go to the verb here in the first half of the verse. Okay, what we have, it's from the verb rabots, and it's hifil, and you probably from OT 501 didn't work with hifils very much. I recognize that, but we have a hifil imperfect. Now, just like in the first verse, for every verb, we always say something about the binyan or stem. Here it's hifil, and we also give a label for the verb type. So remember, I should have said this in the first verse. Every verb gets two labels. Okay, well, let's start with the imperfect first. This word means lie down, and so is it future? It's an imperfect, so go to the imperfect. Is it going to be future? He will lie me down by green pastures. Well, it could be, but notice our English translations, they just also, he makes me lie down in green pastures. Notice it's present. So this is that progressive imperfect, just like we saw in verse 1 in the NIV, which is going to call into question. What we're going to see here is a whole bunch of probably progressive imperfects, which is going to call into question, why did the NRSV and the ESV not make I shall not want into I am not wanting or I lack nothing? So this is a place where where the grammatical analysis has some exegetical significance. So we want to, if we were going to go and do full exegesis, we want to ask, what's the best time? Is this future-oriented psalm, or is this literally a psalm of trust saying, I'm okay now? Notice the difference. That's why we're doing this work, to make observations. Okay. So then what's the hifil? If you go back to the Hebrew review video I showed, call is kind of our base. When you get into the pi'el and hifil, you're getting an element of causation. And so like in the call, this verb just means lie down. When you get to the hifil, and you can look up hifil in 3.1.6, hifil has a causative piece to it, and that's what it is. This is the first type. So a verb that just means lie down, which is an intransitive verb, becomes a transitive verb with a causal dimension in the hifil. And so it's not just he lies down, it's he causes me to lie down, or he makes me lie down. So the word make that we see in English is being added as a way of interpreting the hifil. And then where's the me at? It's a suffix that's attached to the end of the verb there. So this is a hifil, causative, and an imperfect. It looks like it's progressive consistently, though we might note it could be future, though our English translations don't do this. Okay, the second half of the verse, and by the way, we'll be doing a section on Hebrew poetry, and just notice what we have here. In verse 2, we have essentially what's known as synthetic parallelism, where the first line is essentially closely repeated by the second line. He makes me lie down by green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. Those are almost saying very similar things. You might notice in the first verse, the Lord is my shepherd, isn't just repeated. It's almost giving the reason that the Lord is the shepherd, or the effect. The Lord is my shepherd, therefore I shall not want. So there's a little different type of poetry there. But you always want to ask in Hebrew poetry, what's the relationship of the second line to the first line? But that's an assignment that will be coming up. But I just want to point that out here, as we have a lot of synthetic poetry, poetic lines here. So let's look at the second part. Okay, we have a prepositional phrase, preposition all. We have a plural construct of the word for water. So upon waters of, and then we have this word for stillness right here, or still. So upon waters of still. Again, this would be a construct chain inside of a prepositional phrase. So let's look at the preposition first. Look up all. That's going to be 4.1.16, and this again is probably locative. It's giving the place where it's going to be. So it's he leads me at or besides waters of still. Again, what kind of genitive is the word for being translated still? This is going to be another attributive. It's functioning almost like an adjective here. Okay, so we have waters of still, and then the verb, we have a pi'el imperfect with our suffix on there. So he guides me, he leads me by waters of still, besides still waters. Okay, the imperfect, probably progressive again. Notice the consistency in the translated. He leads me, he leads me, he leads me. So that's in the present. That's a progressive. Again, could be future. Maybe you add it. So it could be he will lead me. And then what kind of pi'el is this? Again, you probably haven't seen a lot of pi'els in your work, so go back to 3.1.3. And this is most likely the factative. Again, it's pi'el, hifil, have a causative dimension. So this is the idea that it's not just he's leading me. There's a causal thing. The subject is acting upon the object. He's guiding me, right? So that's the factative use of the pi'el. Okay, let's go to verse 3, and we're rolling right along here. So we have the first word is my nephesh, my soul. So we want to notice soul. Again, probably not the best translation. This isn't the place to do that, but I want you to notice that a human person doesn't have a soul, as though nephesh is something that you can pull out of a person. A human person is a nephesh. In other words, we're an enlivened, embodied soul. So you can't separate the soul and the body in this Hebrew word, though Greek philosophy does make that separation, and that's influenced modern theology. But we don't have a soul, we are a soul. We don't have a body, we are a body. So you can think of nephesh, if you want to use the word soul, kind of as an embodied soul. Just to be clear that it isn't some spiritual part of ourselves, it is us. Okay, so we have my soul. Now the question is this word the subject or the object? Well, when we look at the text here, this is going to be the object. So this is a this is the case. Sorry, my brain just is having a quick malfunction here. This is the accusative case. This is the object. Sorry about that. So this is our accusative case, and it's the direct object of the word, the verb that's being translated, he restores. Now, this is an odd verb form, and this can be a little confusing because it says in the parsing that this is a polel. But notice the root. This is one of the roots. It's from shuv, which you did learn in your first class. It means that's the word for return, and it often means kind of repent. So it could be the place where you see we got to return to the Lord. We need to realign with the Lord. But this is in the a causative case. The polel is just a fancy way that essentially this functions like a pit-el. So just make a note of that. Again, there was no way to prepare you for that in the class. So if this mixed you up a little bit, it's okay. So basically to analyze a polel, which you'll rarely find, it's when there's a verb that has only two strong consonants, that has either a yod or a vav in the middle. This is how you make a pit-el out of it. So we can just say this is a factative. So he is literally causing my soul to return. He's restoring, refreshing my soul is where that translation comes from. Okay, the second half of verse 3. Okay, we start off and we immediately get a verb again. So notice, like in the Hebrew, this is almost like a little chiasm because you have the object, then the verb, and then in the next one we get a verb again, and then we kind of get a longer phrase with a preposition and an object. And so the verb here is the word for lead, and it's hifil, imperfect, third masculine singular. So in the call it means lead, so it's like he's guiding me. So hifil, causative. The imperfect here is another progressive, and I should have said that with the polel in the back here. It's not just a factative, or not just a factative, but it's also the imperfect there would be another, probably progressive if we go by our translations, but possibly also future. Same here. What kind of imperfect? By the translations, it's imperfect. By the translations, it's a progressive imperfect. It could potentially and arguably be a future also if we want to make it all future tense. Okay, then we get another prepositional phrase, and now let's look for the object. Obviously, it's attached to the first object, but its object itself is construct. This is in paths of. Then words joined by makaf, always in construct. Tzedek means righteousness. So this is in paths of righteousness. So first, what's the force of the bait? If you look that up in 4.1, it's going to be another locative, right? It's describing where he's leading. And then what kind of genitive is tzedek? Again, it's describing paths, so this is an attributive, in righteous paths. And then it ends with another particle. It's going to be analyzed as a preposition. And if you go back and look at 4.111, this particular preposition, and we'll see this sometimes used with infinitive constructs, which we'll see later. It's not here, it's followed by a noun. This is just a straight up prepositional phrase. This preposition is either purpose or causative. So it's either he leads me in right paths for the purpose of his name or on account of his name. And what's interesting there is if you look at the English translations, would you say that's purpose or would you say it's causal? By using for, it's a little ambiguous. So it could be either one, and I think we need to decide that. Is it because of who Yahweh is, that he's leading in right paths, or is he leading in a right path for the purpose of his name? I would say causal here, but it could be purpose, and we just want to note that, and we don't have to decide now. Exegesis is exploring possibilities, but the grammar helps us to see possibilities. We could do the deep dive then and look for evidence to argue one way or the other. I would tentatively say this is causal here. Okay, that's verse 3. All right, we're doing great. One more verse to go. So let's go ahead and look at verse 6. And verse 6 is a little bit longer. Sorry about that. What is going on here? I need to back that up. Sorry, my accordance is taking on a life of its own here while I'm recording the screen, apparently. Okay, there's verse 6. Get that right there. Okay, starts off with a particle, which we don't have to do much with, but this is surely. And you might notice it's translated consistently here as surely. Surely goodness and mercy, but that's more of an exclamation. You'll see this in the Psalms, some surely, truly. Tov v'chesed, good and loving kindness. Now, here we have some differences in how best to translate chesed. That's not a grammatical thing, that's a lexical piece. You don't have to pay attention to that, but do notice chesed, that's God's covenant love. Sometimes it's translated steadfast love, a love that won't let go. Some traditional translations use mercy, but it's basically who God is and God's internal character. It's the love of self-giving. This is what gets translated in Greek as agape. Okay, so we have truly good and loving kindness or steadfast love. Then a verb, a call, imperfect, third masculine plural. Why is it plural? Because it has these two words, tov and loving and chesed are the subjects. So love or good and love will follow me. Suffix at the end there is the object. So what kind of imperfect is this? This looks like, in this case, all of the translations do what? They put this into the future. See, if you go back to 3.2.2, which is the imperfect. This would be an example of the future. Now we want to note, unlike the previous verses where we saw lots of progressive imperfects, the translations have decided again we're in the future. And it sounds like this works here. So then exegetically, if we were going to interpret Psalm 23, we'd want to go back and decide, should the whole thing be future, or is it intentional that we alternate between the future and these progressive in terms of the imperfects here? Okay, and then what kind of call is this? This is a fiative because it's an action. Then we get a phrase, all of days of my life. So all of the days of my life. We have a construct chain here. Goodness and mercy will follow me. And then we have an adverbial phrase, basically, all of the days of my life. But this is a construct chain, call, all of the days. That's one. This is a genitive to call. And then my life is the genitive to all of my days. So we have two genitives here that we have to break down. Let's do days first. How does days relate back to all? So how does yameh relate back to kol? Go to genitive 2.2. Now this isn't possessive in this case. This is a way of modifying the word all, or limiting. We're not talking about all as in everything. We're talking about all days. So that gives us the measure. This genitive marks the type of the thing measured. So this is all of days of my life. So all of the days of my life. And then what's the second genitive? How does my life modify all of the days? Well, in this case, this looks like it is possession. All of the days belonging to my life. All right, almost done now. And we have a v, Then we have a verb. And notice this is going to be tricky, so pay careful attention to this one because this may be a new learning for you. Okay, we have a vav. And whenever you have a vav attached to either what looks like an imperfect or a perfect, this is going to be a perfect plus vav consecutive, or in the other case, an imperfect plus vav consecutive. Okay? And so we don't want to miss that element. And what that does is we can still analyze the call the same. This is going to be fiative. It means I will return to the house of the Lord forever. I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. It's potentially, there's some textual stuff going on here, but this would be a fiative. And in this case, if you go to 3.5.2, and the key thing here is this isn't just a perfect because it has the vav on it, and you can see in the helps at the bottom, it's going to say consecutive on there. 3.5.2 is the perfect plus vav consecutive, and this is a sequential. It's carrying on the force of the clause that happens directly in front of it, and that's why this perfect is translated into the future, because it takes on the same force as the previous verb. If you have questions about that, we can go over that in the class. And so I will dwell in house of Yahweh. Preposition bait, this is a locative bait. Go back to 4.1 again. House of the Lord, the house of the Lord, the house belonging to the Lord. This is a genitive possession. And then le orek yamim. Construct chain, length of days, for length of days. So go back to lamed first. What kind of lamed is this going to be? This is a lamed that's marking some time in some ways. So this is something like, it's really forever, but this would be a temporal idea in this case, because it's giving us the time. And notice our translations say things like, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Some do my whole life. So they're playing around with how to best bring that phrase into English. But this is for length of days. Length with respect to days. What kind of genitive is this? Go back to 2.2. This is 2.2.6. This is specification. All right, we made it. Again, review this carefully. Maybe go back over it again if you need some help. And if you have any questions, raise them and I will help you out. Again, it's going to get easier as we go forward. Again, thanks for listening, and it's my absolute privilege to be your professor this semester.